A new study endeavors to explain the difference between atheists and agnostics. And I don't mean in the actually using the definitions of each of those words and exploring the philosophical similarities and differences between them. I mean just asking people which one they self-identify as and then what other things they self-identify as. It's kind of complicated. Let's get into it. So first, my own background. I spent my first 7 years attending a Christian Baptist church, my next 10 years considering myself a Christian Baptist, and then the next 20-some years as an agnostic atheist. That's right. I'm every conservative Christian parent's worst nightmare, a pious God-botherer who went away to college, took one philosophy class, and immediately became a non-believing socialist asshole. You may immediately notice that I describe myself using both of the terms that I previously suggested are mutually exclusive, agnostic and atheist. I'm both, because they're actually terms that address very different things, though many people don't realize this or don't use them in that way. I'll also note that I am a language descriptivist, not a prescriptivist, which means that I believe words mean what most people think they mean and not necessarily what the dictionary says they mean. But sometimes, especially in a scientific or a philosophical context, it's useful to keep distinct meanings for words independent of what the general population believes. Like when we talk about evolutionary theory as opposed to your theory that your cat is secretly trying to kill you. Theory might mean something different scientifically because it's still useful in that respect. So it is with atheist and agnostic. When I say that I'm an agnostic atheist, this is what I mean. Gnosticism refers to knowledge. Is it possible to know with absolute certainty whether or not there is such a thing as a God? In general, no. I can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no Christian God or Muslim God or Jewish God or Egyptian God or Zoroastrian God or unicorns or Santa Claus or any other magical being that disappears whenever you try to look too closely for it. And I'm an atheist because I believe that none of those things exist. I believe that none of them exist. I go about my day-to-day life assuming that I'm not going to be supernaturally gifted commandments etched into stone tablets or impaled by a unicorn. With that in mind, we can separate people into 4 broad categories based on knowledge versus belief. Agnostic atheists like me who think we can't know for sure whether or not there's a God, but who believe there's not enough evidence for one. There's Gnostic atheists who think we can know for sure whether or not there's a God and who believe there isn't one. Agnostic theists who think we can't know for sure but believe there is a God. And Gnostic theists who think we can know and believe there is one. It would be interesting, I think, to examine the personality differences between each of these quadrants, particularly the Gnostics in general versus the agnostics. Do Gnostics have more rigidity in their beliefs compared to agnostics? Are they more emotionally stable? Are they more or less open-minded? Are they more or less anxious? That would be interesting, but that's not what this new study is about. In Being Agnostic, Not Atheist, Personality, Cognitive, and Ideological Differences, psychologists asked 600 Belgians how they self-identified, atheist, agnostic, or Christian. Anyone who said they were anything other than those 3 categories were discarded, which left 551 people. They then gave those people a questionnaire to determine why do many religious non-believers self-identify as agnostics instead of atheists. As described, I think a study like that would also be interesting because, as I said, many people, even most people maybe, don't necessarily know the difference between atheist and agnostic, and that includes people who self-identify with those labels. And promisingly, this paper opens with the pointed question, why do many religious non-believers self-identify as agnostics instead of atheists? Unfortunately, they go on to answer that question by exclusively examining the differences in personality between those two groups, asking them questions to rate their own level of neuroticism, pro or antisocial tendencies, open-mindedness, cognitive abilities, religiosity, and spirituality. I'll skip straight to their findings just for the record. I'll quote directly from the abstract. Compared to atheists, agnostics were more neurotic, but also more pro-socially oriented and spiritual and less dogmatic. Strong self-identification as atheist, but not as agnostic, was positively related to analytic thinking and emotional stability, but also dogmatism. Nevertheless, spiritual inclinations among both agnostics and atheists reflected low dogmatism and high pro-social orientation, and additionally, among agnostics, social and cognitive curiosity. So I read all of this and I was just baffled. What are we meant to do with this information? In the full paper's discussion, they describe how they believe these results provide indirect evidence to support their hypotheses that being agnostic reflects a distinct psychological category, not reducible, for instance, to being a closet atheist. They go on to say, non-believers who prefer to self-identify as agnostic and not as atheist may be 1, more anxious and hesitant about the best answer to give to the fundamental existential questions. 2, more interested in and respectful of people from opposite sides and their unbeliefs and values. 3, less certain and more flexible regarding their own beliefs and worldviews. And or 4, more religiously socialized and today more valuing non-religious spirituality. The latter possibility allows agnostics not to throw the baby, spirituality, out with the bathwater, religion. Finally, high analytic thinkers may turn out to self-identify strongly as atheists, but not necessarily as agnostics. Wow, fascinating. So much indirect evidence for these hypotheses that still remain open. If only there were a way to gather direct evidence to confirm or refute them, like, I don't know, maybe by, asking atheists and agnostics why they identify the way they do. You could do that. Look, I understand, like, sometimes you can't just straight up ask someone a question in psychological research and get the unvarnished truth. But in many cases, it can be surprisingly effective. For instance, when you're in a highly secularized country like Belgium, where there's not a lot of reasons why a person would lie to a researcher asking them anonymous questions about why they consider themselves atheist instead of agnostic. Here's how I would personally design a survey to puzzle out the answers to their hypotheses. I'd ask people to define what they think atheist means and what they think agnostic means. I would ask for their honest opinion on whether or not they believe in a God and on whether or not they think it's possible to be certain there is or isn't a God. Maybe I'd give them a little quadrant and they could put a marker where they think their mindset lands. I would compare where they place themselves with how they describe themselves. Are self-described atheists more likely to put their marker in the no belief, high certainty quadrant? Are self-described agnostics more likely to put their little marker on the no belief, low certainty quadrant? And then I just straight up ask them why they identify as atheist instead of agnostic and vice versa. Is it because you have a negative view of one of those terms? Is it because the actual definition just doesn't fit with what you believe? And by the time you get all of that information, then personality information can actually be interesting. For instance, atheists who prefer the term agnostic because they don't like the stereotype of an atheist might be more neurotic than those who prefer the term just because they think it actually better describes them. Maybe people whose self-identification more closely matches their beliefs are also more analytical than people who, for instance, call themselves agnostic simply because they haven't thought too critically about their own beliefs. So yeah, while I think this study could have been interesting, it just ends up being a muddled mess that misses a golden opportunity to actually learn more about how people with a minority belief system, even in Belgium, that exists outside of an organized religion, how those people interrogate their own beliefs and how they then represent those beliefs to the outside world. Atheism and agnosticism are interesting because they're philosophies that don't have communities and leaders who offer consistent, frequent guidance on how to think about those beliefs, and how those beliefs should inform their behavior. Sure, there are the atheists that will simply do whatever Richard Dawkins tells them to do because, let's be honest, human's gonna human. But there's just nothing that compares to a person going to the same church every Sunday and listening to the same preacher read from and interpret the same book over and over and over again from birth to death. People within the same religious sect will disagree, but on a population level, because of that consistent teaching, you can make certain assumptions about everyone who calls themselves Catholic, for instance. And you just can't do that with everyone who calls themselves atheist. For that reason, we need research on that population to be way more in-depth and way better thought out than this. Personally, if I had to take that survey and pick either atheist or agnostic, I'd probably pick atheist just because it better describes the way that I walk around in the world and behave. And because more people will understand what it means compared to saying agnostic. Way too many people think that agnostic just means you can't make up your mind. You're not sure what you believe, and I never want to give people the wrong impression that I lack convictions. God forbid, so to speak. I think I have a lot of atheists and agnostics and other non-believers on this channel, so I'd be interested in seeing how you guys tend to self-identify and why. Comment below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing if you haven't yet. And if you really enjoyed this video, become a patron over at patreon.com/Rebecca. You can always click the link in the description below. All of my videos on this channel, for at least the last 5 years, have this. You can go through to Patreon. Even if you're not a patron, the transcript is there in full for you to see with all of the citations. So anybody can see that. But if you become a patron, then you will get bonus stuff like ad-free early videos, weekly newsletters, monthly Q&As. So please consider becoming a patron if you can. Thanks so much to everyone for watching.